Silberberg, who's just published a fascinating study of Jewish immigration to Victoria in the 19th century. And she will be in discussion with Rabbi John Levi and will be introduced in a few moments by Professor Bill Rubenstein. This is, I believe, the first time the Australian Jewish Historical Society has conducted a virtual meeting via Zoom, and we're being dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century. This webinar, a new word, is to be recorded by the Australian Jewish Historical Society and by the University of Melbourne, and a podcast will be made for the Melbourne University History Workshop series. It appears that we have participants by the, we're jointly doing this with the Australian Jewish Genealogical Society and the Lamm Library. And I think, David can confirm, I think invitations have gone out to branch members in New South Wales and perhaps in other places. And like every other organisation in Victoria, our organisation continues to function with the aid of technology. The committee continues to meet, and we continue to be active in our research of Australian Jewish history and the preservation of historical records. Just while I'm at it, we have a future event coming up, which I'll remind you of the date of, by Dr. Gabriel on the 22nd of October. And there's another speaker in the wings, Jessica North, who's written a book on Esther Abrahams, who is also lined up to address us this year. May I just acknowledge the fabulous work done by our Secretary, David Marlowe, who finds time in a very busy life to devote considerable time and effort to the Society, and who's organised this evening's event. And if I can just, having mentioned Jessica North and Elizabeth and Avril Abba, in the meantime, we've welcomed Professor Andrew Marcus and Joel Silver to the committee, and we've farewelled Trevor Cohen and Clive Fredman, who've retired after a lifetime of active service. And it seems timely to remind members of the extensive benefits which accrue from annual subscription.
The Australian Jewish Historical Society is recording this as does the University of Melbourne. So it will be available one day.
Yes, as well as receiving 2 journals a year and informative meetings, the Australian Jewish Historical Society website has been updated with thousands of new records accessible online, free to members, and the website is electronically accessible with a mass of material. Now, I shan't go into that anymore. I just want to, as I say, acknowledge the fabulous work of David Marlowe. And if I can, I think, although he's allocated me 10 minutes, I don't want to speak any longer than I've done. I want to hand over to Bill Rubenstein, who's going to introduce tonight's program.
Thanks, Bill.
Not sure. Where is he?
Can't see him.
Where have you gone, Bill?
He's not there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Just we can't see you.
I think he's muted himself again.
You better get rid of me, David, and stick Bill in my place.
No, it takes up to 300, doesn't it?
I've only got up to 100, but I can always up it if we need to.
But can you see me now?
No.
No.
We haven't actually seen you. We haven't seen you yet, Bill.
I think you have in the corner. Well,
We'll go
I just
on.
don't understand it.
Come back.
Can you see me now? Yes, you should. Yeah, now you can.
Now we can see you.
Right, okay. I was pressing the wrong button as usual. Anyway, thank you very much, Gavin. As I said, I'm not one of those people who thinks that the person who introduces the speaker or who gives the vote of thanks at the end also is entitled him to give a second lecture. And therefore, I will be as brief as I can. The early period of Australian Jewish history is a fascinating one, and it's been interestingly covered in this important book by our speaker tonight. There are certain features of Australian Jewish history in its earlier period, which sets it apart from other diaspora communities in countries of new settlement. For one thing, most of the immigrants who came here in the 19th century were English-speaking Jews from Britain, and they were not German speakers or Yiddish speakers. And secondly, if I could just highlight this for 1 second, there was already an ethno-religious dispute here of some considerable importance between Irish Catholics and British Protestants, to which the Jews were not a part and were sort of regarded as honorary Protestants. Now, I want to stop there and turn over to our speakers, but let me just say that our November journal is on the way, and it's been edited very successfully, mainly by Dr. Hilary Rubenstein, my wife, who's sitting next to me, and it contains much fascinating material, and it will be out soon. Thank you very much. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
No, we can hear
finished.
it.
John.
And
I'm finished.
I'll show you.
Right. Sue, can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. Can we start? Okay. Can I, first of all, because it hasn't happened, show everybody the book, A Network Community. My first question, therefore, to you is, what's the meaning of the word network? Why did you choose that word?
Thanks, John. I chose that word because I was actually responding to a lot of literature in historical literature that looks at networks within the British Empire. And it sees those networks as predominantly Protestant. There's occasional references to the Chinese community, but the networks that are really explored are white and largely Protestant. And I wanted to draw attention to the fact that, in fact, this was a community that was not only networked to itself and networked really widely amongst the Jewish world, but also contributed to the networks that created colonial Australia and brought different networks than the ones that have often previously been explored in wider literature. So I thought network covered both internal and external forces working with this community.
Were other communities in early Australia also networked, or are we a unique community?
John, can you speak up a little bit and a bit more forward?
Yes.
I think John's speaking very audibly.
We're going to have an argument. You heard me.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, John? Sorry.
Sorry. Is the Jewish community the only networked community in this 19th century, or were there others?
Well, I'm sure there are others. I've studied this one. So, yes, there were lots of other network communities. I think what's interesting about this one is it brings, as I said, new networks. And those networks are both within the diaspora of what people traditionally see as the Jewish diaspora into Europe, but also a rapidly expanding English-speaking diaspora. And because these migrants or settlers came from places other than the British Empire, although in smaller numbers, they're also networked through the Sephardi world, through North Africa, through Turkey and places like that. And so their networks are quite wide and slightly different to other communities. Yes, there are other communities that were networked, but I haven't looked at those.
Does our network mean a family network, or just simply from where we came from?
No, I think the networks are multiplicitous. They're families, and the one on the front cover is a networked family, but they're also networked politically. They're networked through communications, letters, journals. They're very aware of what's going on in other parts of the world. They're networked through newspapers and material that's being sent around the world, and through their business connections. I mean, I like to use the example of your family, which has a scrapbook which contains the minutes from synagogues in Birmingham and Liverpool, so that Nathaniel Levi is interested in what's going on back in those places. Someone like Emanuel Steinfeld is using his networks through Europe and his wider networks, because he travels all the time, to bring back political and economic ideas that are incorporated into government policy or used to establish the intercolonial trade conferences, things like that. And so they're using a whole range of networks to develop colonial society, and I believe to develop their perceptions of themselves in the Jewish world.
How did they perceive themselves within the Jewish world? As lucky, exiled, set upon? How did they see themselves?
I think they saw themselves as, well, I presume lucky. This is the first society where Jews came with first settlement, as your work has shown, and also to a place where there were fundamentally no restrictions on them. And so what they did was they were quite assertive in their pronouncements of being Jewish and arguing that as Jews they had every right to be treated as equals in society. And largely the wider society responded to that and supported their arguments for inclusion or where they pushed back on policy and things like that. So I think they were able to really use this society to both create a Jewish world that reflected them, largely as Anglo-Jews, and to help shape this colonial society that they were there at the formation of, to reflect their values and respect their values. So if you want me to give you an example, for example, with the debates in the 1867 Royal Commission into Education and the subsequent 1872 Education Acts, Jews are arguing for free and secular education because they're saying morality is a universal principle and sectarianism shouldn't be tolerated. And if people want to have a religious education, that's their right, but the state shouldn't be imposing it upon anybody. And for everyone to be treated equally, you know, it needs to be a free and secular education.
So we ended up sending our kids to Scotch College.
Well, we sent our children to a number of schools. Education isn't compulsory till the 1870s. And even after that, particularly women weren't necessarily being sent to school, they were having governesses. I mean, right up till my grandmother had a governess, she never went to school. But people went to a variety of schools that offered a variety of things. These people saw themselves as part of the community and they saw themselves as Jewish. So there were a number of attempts at Jewish schools, and then a number of schools taught Hebrew and Jewish subjects. So there were private Jewish schools. So Julia Farmer had a school in Fitzroy for educating young ladies of the Jewish persuasion. Scotch College taught Hebrew for a number of years. Places like Wesley and Melbourne Grammar advertised very widely in the Jewish press. And Hebrew teachers were in places, in other private schools and colleges in Melbourne. And then families made a big effort to have, private Jewish tutors coming to their schools. But if you look at the way the synagogues were established, they're often established first as educational establishments and then as synagogues. So Walter Lindenthal, who's employed in the 1840s for the Melbourne Hebrew congregation, is employed as a teacher and reader. And the same with the establishment of St Kilda Hebrew congregation, they establish a school and synagogue. And so the educational component is always really important. And the other complication is the way the acts that governed education in Victoria changed. And so the attempts, particularly through the Melbourne Hebrew congregation to establish a school, were a bit of sort of push and pull as the Education Acts changed and demanded different things of schools. So it's not quite as simple as saying these people chose to send their children to non-Jewish schools. it's a complicated issue, I'd say. But they were really struggling to give their children a Jewish education in one form or other.
What did they do with the children of mixed couples? Because that was a major problem, wasn't it?
That is the major preoccupation, I would say, other than making sure food's kosher, of 19th century Jewry. The issue is really complex because until the 20th century, there were far more Jewish men in Victoria than there were Jewish women. And for most of the 19th century, it was 2 Jewish men for every Jewish woman. So it's, again, not a simple issue of saying these people weren't marrying Jews. There weren't any Jewish women for them to marry. So they took a very strict and sometimes pragmatic approach to what to do. In the 1840s and 50s, they were struggling about whether or not they could circumcise the children of non-Jewish mothers, and it went a bit to and fro. And then at one point they said, well, there's nothing to stop them being circumcised, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're Jewish. Excuse me. It wasn't until the 1860s that it was considered Melbourne had sufficient people with rabbinic knowledge to establish a Beth Din. So once the Beth Din was established, there was attempts at formalising the process for conversion. But when you read the letters that were written to the chief rabbi where families asking to convert their wives or children, they really stress how much effort they're putting into giving them a Jewish education and observing Jewish customs. So I think, again, they are really trying to manage Jewish continuity in one form or another. So, for example, there's a really good example in my book of someone called Jacob Hart, who in 1869 tries to get his wife and family converted. No, he dies in 1869, I'm sorry. And when he dies, the papers are full of praise. This is the man who was running the Hevra Kadisha in Melbourne. And the papers are full of praise for how he was a central pillar of the Jewish community. And in fact, they set up a subscription. His wife had already predeceased him. They set up a subscription to support his children. So people could be really a part of the Jewish community and still have not managed to find a Jewish wife.
Yes, I wonder how many thousands of Victorians there are who are product of the chief rabbi's obduracy. Anyway, how did the Jews...
I have to say, John, that when reading the letters I've read, and I've read many of them, I haven't found anyone who has refused conversion. Now, because of the some of the complications of access to those records, I haven't read the 8,000 pages of them. I've read a lot of them. But it seems that they were saying, we don't want to convert, but they were being pragmatic and saying, well, if you go through these processes, we will from the 1860s when the Beth Din was established.
I'd like to change the subject a bit, but you've raised so many interesting questions by your answer. I'm tempted to go on, but I think that the whole picture that you're painting is much wider than that. What happened when the Germans turned up? Did it make a difference to the way in which the community, the Central Europeans?
I think the Central Europeans are two lots. The slightly more majority are people from the German territories, and then the slightly lesser, the third greatest number are people from the Russian Empire. But they're still very, very, very small numbers. We're talking, 300 to, 250, 300 people. So they're not, and most of the Germans have lived in Britain previously. So that might mean they've come to England as children, like the Levinsons or the Jacobs families that I'm descended from. So they will come up in the records as being Prussian, but in fact they've been in England since they were very small children. So are they German or English? The people like Moritz Michaelis had spent 10 years in England prior to coming to Australia. Emanuel Steinfeld has spent a long time in England. So I think you'll find most of the Germans were quite, had come via England in the first instance. So I think their perception of the world is probably tainted by that, and they're choosing to go from England to a British colony. What's interesting in Australia is people do not marry they very rarely marry people from the same place, and they don't form any any associations that reflect their place of birth. So the Germans will do. Many of them do form the German do join the German association, but the German association is both Jewish and non-Jewish Germans, not Jewish or Germans or either. So they're seeing themselves. I don't think they're seeing themselves particularly. I don't think that changes it. And in fact, if you read what Emmanuel Steinfeld says, he says very loudly and clearly that he is an Australian and he is British and things like that.
Yes, but he also says how much he appreciates going back to Germany.
To see what's going on. And yeah, he does argue for a German form of tax, tax unification.
Right. That's fascinating. So the thing that really knocked me off my seat was really your emphasis on the Sephardi group. I knew that there was Sephardim in early colonial Australia, of course, but I had no idea that there were so many. Can you tell us a little bit about the background of the Sephardim, especially the Caribbeans?
Yeah, well, so there are sort of three groups of Sephardim. There are the Sephardim from London, and there are Sephardim from the Caribbean, as you said, and then there are odd Sephardim from North Africa and Turkey, but very, very small numbers. So the Sephardim from London are coming as other settlers, either under sentence or as free settlers or as parts of chain migration. So the Ottolenghi family start coming out because of a convict, but spend 50 years and they all come out as a chain migration. The ones that people are really interested in is the ones from the Caribbean who predominantly come from Jamaica. And I'm particularly interested in this group. Jamaica was really under the control of the Columbus family, and therefore it was outside the Inquisition. So Jews, while it was under Spanish control, did live in Jamaica, but they couldn't practice openly. But there are references to them in the 16th century and things. When the British took over Jamaica in the 1650s, they expelled the Spanish, but they allowed the Jews to stay because they called them Portuguese. And at that point, the Jewish community was able to sort of come out into the open. And the first synagogues were built in the very early 18th century. Interestingly, the Sephardi community, I believe, had a greater life expectancy than other Europeans, and so did slightly better. But in Jamaica, Jews were not very well treated. They were disenfranchised and they were very heavily taxed. And those enfranchisement wasn't resolved till after slavery was abolished, because they couldn't have a white population being treated worse than a black population, and that's when Jews were enfranchised. So the Jews that come to Melbourne obviously come after the abolition of slavery, and but I have been able to track back, and they are all the children. Most of those aren't old enough to have been slave owners, but their parents were certainly all slave owners. And so from the 1850s to about the 1870s, the Melbourne Hebrew congregation had a separate Sephardi minyan, and I've seen references to Charles Dite arguing that Ballarat should also have a Sephardi service.
Really?
And so, like in England, some of the prominent members of the community, like the Montefiores, were obviously members of the Sephardi community. And the Benjamins.
Really? I didn't know that.
I think the Benjamins are Sephardi, yeah.
Can I...
Maybe wrong, but I think they might be.
Can I shift the topic to a favourite topic of yours, and that's architecture? Place and the milieu and the role of Jews in creating and building and owning Melbourne, early Melbourne.
Yeah. Where would you like me to go? Start. I could have written a book on this. I'm still contemplating doing it.
Oh, you practically did, yeah.
I know. I only got a chapter in. The interesting thing about Jewish Melbourne is that Jews live where Melbourne develops. They don't live in any one particular area. there is no ghetto in Melbourne in any shape or form. But saying that, Jews choose to live in some very quaint little places. And there are some congregations of Jews in some obscure places. And I actually have brought up some of these photos, so I can share my screen and show you, as this is my favorite topic, some of the images of these places, but otherwise I can just talk you through them. But there's a sort of progression through a number of particularly interesting buildings. There is a street that runs between Nicholson and Brunswick Street, the bottom of the museum, called King William Street. King William Street's built in the subdivided. It's sold in the land sales in the 1830s. It's subdivided in the 1850s into little wooden houses are being built there. In the 1860s, they get demolished and stone and brick houses get built. And that street has some very interesting connections with our other speaker here, because there's a number of interconnected families that live in that street. And that's a really common pattern of the Jewish community, that they live near their relatives. So there's a number of people in this street called Levi or Levy, some of whom I've been able to connect together and some of whom I can't. But one of them is John's ancestors, who live in a row of houses on the south side of the street. And also in the street is the family of Solomon Phillips, who came here because he wanted to be the rabbi of the Melbourne Hebrew congregation. He came to Sydney as a sort of rabbinical figure. Wasn't employed in that role, but his extended family lived there, including two of his daughters, one who was Rosetta, who married Alexander Fox, and that's the street in which Emmanuel Phillips Fox was born in. There are two buildings on the corner of Glass Terrace, I presume most people know, in Gertrude Street, and Hugh Glass built the building on the other corner of Gertrude and in Brunswick Street. And they were the homes of a number of Jewish families, including the interconnected families involved in or the children of the families involved in the Great Gold Dust robbery of the 1830s, the Caspers and their husbands, and a number of families would move from one sort of location to the other as they came up the social stratum. But the really interesting concentration of Jews is in East Melbourne. And Jews were really major purchasers in the first land sales of East Melbourne. The majority of huge purchases of land were Jewish investors. And Jews lived on both sides of Victoria Parade, where the hospital is, and down from the Ioneer Hospital. And those mansions that are still extant on that side of the road were all built by Jewish builders. And Albert Street also became a great centre of Jewish life. Obviously, the synagogue was there. So there are these interesting pockets, and Kilda becomes an early area of Jewish life. Marcus Clark said very disparaging things about it. And then Jews live around Melbourne. So it's, and they're using the most fashionable architects of the day to build their houses and their synagogues.
Lamm Barnett.
Oh, Noam Barnett's a bit later. He's a Jewish architect. Prior to that, they're using the non-Jewish fashionable architects. But yes, Noam Barnett built houses for a number of Jewish landowners and also built their factories. He claimed to have built a house in every street in Melbourne, or built a building in every street in Melbourne.
And grew up in Melbourne.
And grew up in Melbourne, went to Scotch College, yes, and was a great advocate for things. I mean, he was a huge letter writer, so he's writing to the paper on architecture and on Jewish issues and on education and on all sorts of things. And yes, and buildings, built the latest iteration of the Melbourne Hebrew congregation in Toorak, or designed it, I mean. Yeah.
Yes. So when did the Jews actually leave the city?
Well, they leave the city as people leave the city. They often, they live above their businesses, and that goes on right through the 19th century. It's as the suburbs develop, people move out to the suburbs, and you can just track the Jews moving out. By the late 19th century, they're in Malvern. So they're moving with everybody else. So they're not, people live above their shops in the 19th century, and they live in porous, the back alleyways and laneways if they're very poor, and they live in the major thoroughfares if they're not. And as I said, they move out as the city develops.
And final question before I think we throw it open to everybody. the parliamentarians, the number of Jews in the in the colonies parliament. Can you give us some background on that?
Yeah, yeah, I think this is a really fascinating issue, and I think Jews, and it shows what the position Jews had, and I think it's about, you know, this position of confidence I think they had, so that as soon as there's any form of representative government, Jews and in New South Wales, Victoria, wherever, Jews are standing for election, and they're standing for election from the 1840s for the Melbourne City Council. Your ancestor Nathaniel Levi is the first Jew to be elected to Parliament, and he starts my book. Sorry, people are sending me notes. And he, I think it's very interesting. The reason I put him at the beginning of the book is he stands for, he takes his seat in Parliament wearing a yarmulke and reading from an Old Testament, you know, taking his oath on an Old Testament. When Benjamin is elected Lord Mayor of Melbourne, he has a function for, I can't remember if it was 1,000 people or several hundred people, and he has kosher catering. You know, they're not, and people are members of Parliament, they're members of local councils. And the other interesting thing is they're honorary consuls, and they're often honorary consuls for countries that as Jews they wouldn't be allowed to hold civic office in, or from people like Solomon Ifler, who came from Jamaica. He came from a country where he'd been disenfranchised and he becomes Mayor of South Melbourne. So that's a really interesting issue too. And I think that's, again, the international perspective these people bring. So someone like Alexander Marx, who traded in Japan for 40 years, had a trading and lived in Japan and on and off for that period of time, becomes the consul for Japan and argues very publicly against the White Australia policy.
Oh, that sounds a very interesting person to study.
Mm.
I really would like the people, I would like everybody to have a chance to join in this and ask questions and argue. Sue, it was fantastic. Who's in charge of choosing how to? Yes,
Helen Selby's just pointing out that her and my great-grandfather was a councillor, and even, you know, our family were councillors for the Portland Shire. So there were Jews in country Victoria too doing this. I mean, I spent yesterday looking at somebody who lived in Casterton and was on the council in Casterton. You know, Jews were all over Victoria. They're not just in Melbourne.
No, I know that. Did they come into town for the High Holy Days?
I can't answer that question. I do know, for example, that my grandfather was bar mitzvahed at Ballarat, even though they lived over 200 kilometres away in the Western District.
In Branxholme.
In Branxholme. So people are putting a lot of effort into it. In the 1850s and 60s, no, I can answer your question. In the gold towns, what they're doing is they're borrowing material. And so the synagogues are lending Torahs and other ceremonial items to communities with numbers in them in the mining towns. They do charge them the donations that they receive. And of course, there are synagogues in Bendigo, Ballarat and Geelong. So by the late 19th century, there are 6 synagogues in Victoria. We shouldn't forget.
Amazing, isn't it? David Marlowe, what happens next?
Well, people can post their questions on chat and just post it to everyone, or post it to, it's probably best to post it to everyone so everyone can see the question. There we go, we've got one. So Phil's asked, would you say something about Benvenuto?
Oh, Benvenuto is a magnificent building. I didn't talk about the bottom end of Drummond Street. The bottom end of Drummond Street, nearest Victoria Parade, is absolutely a Jewish enclave. So on the east side of the road, you have 2 mansions next to each other. Benvenuto, which was Phil's ancestors built it. Leah Solomon built it. She was the daughter-in-law of someone from the Great Gold Dust robbery, I mean, sorry, wrong century. And she built that house. It's now named Medley Hall and run by the University of Melbourne. And next to it is Rosaville, which was built by another family, a really beautiful little Mannerist house. Across the road are a number of terraces. Melburnia Terrace was built by Wolfe Davis. And then going up the hill towards the university, most of those houses were built by a number of Jewish developers or owner-occupiers. So that end of Drummond Street was really a Jewish enclave. But yes, Benvenuta was built by Leah Solomon.
Anyone else? Or we're going where we can continue. Absolutely talk.
Yes, sir. Could you just tell us the name of that street where those houses?
King William Street.
King William.
I've actually, I mean, I could share my screen. I can share my screen and show you a little picture of it if you'd like.
That would be good. That would be good.
Yeah.
Just give me, oh, I can't. Sorry. David, you'd have to give me access.
Okay, but if I make you
I don't know how.
You might be able to.
Oh,
Right now.
there are 3 people in the meeting room, it says. This is just from a slide from something else I did. So these are 2 pictures of King William Street that come from the O'Brien collection. I can't identify if this, can you see this on your screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know, they're not labelled and they're not extant in King William Street. There are 1860s houses left on the north side of King William Street. I know the Levis lived on the south side, which is now demolished, but this is sort of what King William Street would have looked like in the 1860s.
Sue, just a comment. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You can hear. Yes, just a comment about the Melburnia Terrace, which is absolutely magnificent. It's never been given the, I suppose, the publicity within the community that it deserves. And Wolfe Davis built 7 of them. And the first was where he and his wife lived. And they had a sukkah upstairs on the roof, which is still there. And down below was a stone-faced mikveh. They had their own private mikveh, which he needed because he had 6 daughters. And as each daughter got married, he would hand them over one of the houses. And it's a most extraordinary episode.
Well, they inherited the houses when he died.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, they might have, but they were all living there in a row. Yes. Amazing.
What's interesting about the Jewish community and their wills is that they very rarely prioritise one child. They will sometimes write out a child from a will if they didn't marry someone who was Jewish, and they will quite often say, if my children don't marry someone who's Jewish, they don't inherit. But they very rarely, in fact, I was looking at a will yesterday that did only leave to one child and didn't leave to the wife. That was the first one I think I've come across, and often they will protect, even before the Married Women's Act, they will really try and put wording in that protects any inheritance that women have and keep it free from their husbands. I've been asked to talk about the Jewish community in Carlton in the 19th century. I'm not quite sure what, I mean, Carlton and Fitzroy are the first 2 suburbs in Melbourne, and so the Jewish community are moving there. And as I said, they're building or living in, you know, perfectly lovely houses. Jews are there very early because they're buying land in the early land sales, and you know, it's walking distance to both synagogues.
Did they go to both synagogues? I thought
they went to both synagogues.
They did.
One of the interesting things, if I share my screen again, is I think is interesting, is, and I've got a map here. Let me just find the map. Here we go. This is the whole map of East Melbourne. Can you see that?
Yes.
And this is as East Melbourne was originally laid out, and it I can't see it. That's any problem. It gives it gives land. It sets aside land for all the various religious denominations for churches. And then Bishop's Court's built, which gives it absolutely, you know, great cachet. And if you think about it, you've got St. Pat's Cathedral and you've got Parliament. And where does the East Melbourne Hebrew congregation choose to move itself in the 1870s? Right here, which is the sort of absolute religious and political place of power in Melbourne. And I think it's a really public statement. They use the most fashionable architects, Crouch and Wilson. They build these sort of Renaissance palace with mansard roof. But what do? They put its name in Hebrew across the front of it. And that's the first time a building in Melbourne, as I can identify, that's had a Hebrew across the front. And it's plonked right here in this absolute position of religious and political power in Melbourne. And I think that's a really interesting statement in itself.
I saw that somebody asked a question about anti-Semitism.
I've come across very little anti-Semitism.
Marcus Clark, for example.
He did make anti-Semitic remarks, but generally when there are debates about things in the paper that Jews are agitating for, so for example, opening shops on Sundays, people or secular education, people will write in and say, yes, it is disenfranchising Jews that they have to close their shops on a Saturday, but they can't trade on a Sunday, and that's really unfair, and they're paying their taxes and they're law-abiding people and they're really philanthropic. So people are actually very positive. And the fact that Jews also, the Jewish community also chooses to have all its public spats in the paper, historians, is I think shows they're feeling quite comfortable about their position.
That's a very good point.
And I mean, as early as 1856, the Argus is printing ads with Hebrew font. Now, for them to have ads with Hebrew font, they have to have had, it's hot metal printing. So they have to have the Hebrew font. And so, Jews have, in 1856, you've got ads for matzah with matzah written in Hebrew. So I think that's showing an integrated position.
That's fantastic. Anybody else got a
yes, I'd like to make two comments. One was, I think you mentioned 6 synagogues, did you? There was the Burke Street, there was the Russell Street one, which is now a restaurant. There's the East Melbourne one, and which were the other ones at that time?
There was St Kilda, Ballarat, there was St Kilda, Melbourne Hebrew Congregation and East Melbourne in Melbourne, and then there was Geelong, Bendigo and Ballarat.
Oh yes, but 3 in Melbourne. And my grandfather went to the Burke Street Synagogue. He was a choir boy in the 1880s, and he had his education there, which was of course Jewish until Bar Mitzvah. And then his father said to he and his other brother siblings, it's off to work. You're now a man, and that's what you did. And it wasn't until the next generation, until several of them, including Wolf Davis. Is that the Wolf Davis who's a doctor went?
No, that's the wrong generation.
But they were second generation and took up tertiary education and in various areas. Thank you. And thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Very few people went on to higher secondary school. I mean, in fact, there were no public secondary schools in Victoria until 1905. So unless you could afford a private education, there were no secondary schools in Victoria. So people didn't have educations past about year 8 in most instances.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Do they have any response to Benjamin Disraeli as the British Prime Minister? I mean, he was Jewish after all. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm just not quite sure what do you, I mean,
was there any Jewish response to a Jewish Prime Minister in Britain?
Well, he technically wasn't Jewish when he became Prime Minister. I've not seen much response to that specifically, no, but they certainly know what's going on. Newspapers and things are being sent around. I haven't seen any particular references to Disraeli though. But I mean, of course, Disraeli was also Sephardi.
That's right.
So I'm very interested in the Jewish Board of Advice, which I believe was the precursor to the Beth Din, and it's how it was able to work either with the chief rabbi in London or by itself.
Do you mean the board that was set up to look at conversions?
Yes. Yeah.
It wasn't prior to the Beth Din, it was parallel to the Beth Din, and it was set up so that before letters went to the chief rabbi in London for applications for conversion, the applicant had to have been agreed to by this joint committee of the 3 Melbourne synagogues. And it didn't always work, and it broke down and it was reconfigured, and you know, they bickered, but that was the process. The process was supposed to be someone applied, they went to this joint committee, then it went to the chief rabbi, then the chief rabbi sent it back, and then they went through a conversion process.
So the Beth Din itself didn't perform,
The Beth Din was responsible for the conversion. Yeah.
And they built a mikveh, of course, in the public baths.
Yeah, there was a mikveh in the public baths.
Which is still there, yes.
But I gather they didn't they didn't adjudicate on conversions without going back to the chief rabbi. Is that right?
No, yeah, they had to. The community had to agree that this person could be converted. Then it went to the chief rabbi. Then it came back, and then the Beth Din was responsible for the conversion.
Thanks very much.
Freemasons. We haven't talked about them.
Jews were very active in the Freemasonry. Freemasonry was attractive because it was both a social network. It believed in a universal God. And the symbols were not considered to be anathema to Judaism, and it provided networks. And Jews were Freemasons all over the world. And there were lodges in Melbourne that were very predominantly Jewish, and then there were Jews in other lodges. But yes, Jews were very, very active Freemasons. And then there were also a number of friendly societies that the Jewish community created for itself, other than the Philanthropic Society. There was a Jewish Aid Society and things like that. So there were both attached to the English branch of the Freemasons and setting up their own friendly societies to support themselves through, you know, the actions of friendly societies do. Yes, and I mean, the most impressive Freemasonry story I think I've got, or the one I use in the book, is actually the cemetery, the funeral procession for Gabriel Marx and his wife Marian Alexander. They drowned in a shipwreck in 1914, and the Marxes were very, very prominent politically and in trade in Fiji. Born in Melbourne, and it's a very interesting story about Jews going out and colonising the Pacific. And after the drowning of Gabriel Marx and his wife, the funeral procession they drowned in Canada, off Canada, went back through Fiji, and there was a Masonic ceremony in Fiji before their coffins were boarded onto a boat for Melbourne to have a Jewish funeral in Melbourne. And all the shops came down and flags were at half-mast, and you know, it was a civic procession, a Masonic civic procession over their coffins before they, you know, they made this detour to Fiji before they came back to Melbourne. So Jews were very prominent could be very prominent in the Freemasons, and still are, I believe.
When they dedicated the Launceston Synagogue, just before the gold rush, it was really a Freemasons ceremony. There weren't enough Jews to even count, but they built the community, the city built the synagogue in spite of the governor.
Moses Rintel acted as the the grand chaplain, or the chief, what I can't remember the exact term, the grand chaplain, grand clergy. This grand clergy role, I might not be getting the title right, for the Freemasons here, and in that capacity he laid the foundation stone for the Benevolent Society, the Melbourne Benevolent Society, not as a rabbi, but as the chaplain for the Freemasons.
And Dagbo did the same in the next century.
Yeah. I think we've got some questions here. And somebody's asking me about schools.
Yeah, that's me, Charles Koppel.
Oh, Charles, hi.
Hi.
Well, as I said, Jews went, I mean, we have to remember, as I said previously, there were no state secondary schools in Victoria until 1905. So for anyone to go to a secondary school, it had to be a private school. And in fact, the Jewish schools that were established weren't secondary schools, they were all primary schools. So to get a secondary education, you had to go to Scotch or Melbourne Grammar or the other schools that are now non-existent. And Scotch College did in the 1870s teach Hebrew. I found references to it. Jews traditionally also went to Wesley and Melbourne Grammar, but they went to other places as well. It's just a lot of those schools no longer exist. And then there were private schools established for Jewish children or Hebrew taught in other private schools. But it is a matter that, you know, people had to be educated.
My question was actually, how common was it for Jews to attend Catholic schools?
I haven't come across any. Sorry, I misread your question. I'm sorry, Charles, I misread your question.
I think I know of some.
Do you? In the 19th century?
No, just on the cusp of the 20th, but yes.
On the 20th century, I know some went to Xavier.
Yes.
The Jesuits were supposed to give a good education, but I haven't come across any in the 19th century.
Yeah, Susie's great uncle was there in 1904 at Xavier.
Wasn't the 19th century.
So my father and my uncle went to Xavier. They were made very welcome there by the brothers, and they had a very good schooling, a very good education. I think they wasted most of it, but they learned how to swim when the brothers threw them off the bridge at Hawthorne into the Yarra River. And that was what the Jesuits taught one to swim. Yeah.
My mother always said she was a good swimmer because she learned to swim in a river.
John Monash, of course, grew up in a German-speaking home in Melbourne.
And went to Scotch.
Yeah, and went to Scotch, that's right. And it was extraordinary. Of course, he was a genius. So he could read French and German and English before his bar mitzvah. How many German-speaking families do you think the Jewish community had in the 19th century?
There are about 250 to 300 Germans in Melbourne, and I've counted to date. I don't know how much they retained their German. I was reading something about the Jacobs family, the first generation. Philip Ackland Jacobs had written for his family. It's not dated, but he was born in the 1860s or 70s. And he talks about going to London and to his uncles where they said their grace after meals in German, which was a bit odd because the uncle Lesser Jacobs had been born in Manchester and his wife was the daughter of an English convict. So it didn't quite make sense to me. I have letters from my family from Sheffield, the Prussian-born parents in Sheffield to their children in Victoria, and those letters are all written in English. They have they have a bit of Hebrew if they're talking about a mezuzah or something that's written in Hebrew, and one letter has a few sentences in Yiddish at the end. But they certainly, you know, there were some very prominent Jews in Melbourne who are parts of the German Association. They saw themselves as German, but I think the whole concept of nationalism for Jews is, I think, quite complex. Jews are coming to Australia from Europe for the gold rush. And that is only as concepts of nationalism are really arising in those countries. You know, Germany isn't a country when those people are leaving. Although the 1848 revolutions are facilitating a certain level of emancipation across Europe for Jews, I think for most people coming from Central and Eastern Europe, their identity is Jewish. It's not German and it's not Polish and it's not Russian. Their identity is Jewish because that, particularly if they came from Eastern Europe, I think Germany is a slightly different kettle of fish, but if they're coming from further east into Europe, the way that communities were managed and controlled and politically and socially, that communities would have, the individuals would have seen themselves as Jewish. They wouldn't have seen themselves as Polish or Russian, I believe. And I've had long conversations with a number of academics in Central and Eastern Europe working on Jewish things, and that's seems to be the consensus of views. So our concepts of nationalism arise from concepts of the nation state, and that's not really relevant to Germany, Poland or Russia at that point in the way we consider it now.
No. And Zionism in Australia, 19th century?
There is. What's interesting in the 19th century is there's a very strong Anglo-Jewish association. And the Anglo-Jewish Association is fighting and agitating for Jewish causes around the world. And then Zionism becomes one of those. Now, there's, big debates about people not being Zionist and being Zionist. I haven't gone into that in very much detail, but I think the issue is about their perceptions of themselves in the world, and although I'm arguing these people feel confident, I think there's always an underlying feeling of slight inconfidence, and I think that plays into it. But there are certainly people who I've come across now, I can't think of the name, somebody who, people are supporting charities in Jerusalem. There's somebody who set up a number of almshouses in Jerusalem. People are even traveling to Jerusalem. So there is a to and fro. I just don't think there's necessarily consensus on the issue. And remember, my research is really stopping at 1900. So
yeah, that's very early.
It's very early.
Yeah. From Helen Sylvie to Sue.
Helen Sylvie. The push and pull factors. I think the push and pull factors are interesting. I mean, obviously the gold rush is an enormous pull factor, and it's a pull factor for people all over the world. But the thing to remember is it's a very expensive place to get to, be it the gold rush or anywhere else. So you had to have a certain level of income to afford to get here. And not only did you have to be able to pay for your fare, you had to you had to kit yourself out to get here, and you also had to lose several months' income while you're on the ship. So there were really no assisted passages for Jews, because assisted passages were targeted at agricultural labourers and servants, which Jews didn't really fit that category. And so there was one little scheme with Carolyn Chisholm and the ladies in London trying to send out 12 Jewish women, which is quite famous, but it isn't. And they do assist, there is an immigration scheme to assist a few people, but it's only a few hundred, it's not a significant number. So the push factors are largely the gold rush, but also this is a place, Jews are urban and they are landless. And so this is an opportunity for people to have another economic future and to potentially own land, which you couldn't own. They weren't going to own a house in London in the early part of the 19th century unless they were very wealthy. And most houses were leasehold. So there are lots of reasons to come. And if you read the arguments about in the 1850s, when they're very, very concerned about the lack of Jewish females, they're actually suggesting that rabbis should be standing in their pulpits in England and sort of agitating for female immigration, because it's a land of the free and it's part of the British Empire and it doesn't have all those nasty things that are happening in America. So I think they're the push-pull factors, and it's a giant chain migration, really. I mean, you get people who get off boats and promptly get married. They're obviously being, they're being arranged marriages.
And I think you say the Jews didn't leave.
Yes, they largely don't leave. I mean, and the ones that leave aren't necessarily, almost nobody goes back to Europe. There are exceptions. I'm just trying to think of his name. The doctor who was involved with the philanthropic organisation early, he goes back to Europe. A few people, some of the the Hellensteins go back to Europe. But largely people will go to England if they don't stay in Australia, or to America some people move on to, and a lot of people go to New Zealand and come back again or stay. But the people who go to England aren't necessarily just English born. They might be Australian born, they might be German born. So there isn't a huge number of them. And they'll often be what's called colonial merchants, or someone like the Telemann brothers who set up this meat processing works in Victoria and then take it to England and are selling sort of processed meats that they can ship before refrigeration into Europe. They sell it to the French army and people like that. So they're using their Australian business connections to re-establish themselves in England.
And I think too that you infer, if not say, that Jews didn't convert to Christianity.
No, very rarely. And I've got a question from Ross. Sorry, Ross, can you just come on and tell me what your question is? I don't quite know if I understand it.
So in the book, you have a section where you talk about there's reporting of community news in newspapers in the UK, and I think there was a German paper. So in a sense, returning back to that earlier theme around the network connections, if you can elaborate on that and how the reporting was a form of that kind of network connection.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important point. So if you look at the Jewish Chronicle, in fact, it actually reports news from Australia and sometimes in far greater detail than it's reporting British news, so Jewish Chronicle in England. And equally, the Hamagid in Prussia, Noam Spiegelvogel in Ballarat is reporting on the goldfields to a Prussian newspaper. And obviously people are reading newspapers from around the world, from France, from Germany, from England. And for example, when they're advertising for rabbis, they're advertising in these international papers. You can see in letters, people talking about newspapers and letters being sent from England to Prussia to Australia. And so people are really, I think, connected to, or attempting to stay connected to, what is happening in the world by both. It's not a one-way communication. There is information from Australia going back to Europe and to England, and information from those places coming here. And I think that's a really important way that this community is very much trying to connect itself into this wider, both British Empire and Jewish diaspora.
I think we may have run out of time, haven't we? Where's David Marlowe? Can't hear you.
David, you're muted.
Sorry, can't hear you.
Calling for Mr. President Gavin.
Ah, where's Gavin?
He's silent too.
Well, you have held, I've been watching the numbers, you have held us, a great number of people. It's been terrific. Sue, it's a great tribute to you, and your book is fascinating. I know history is often turned into his stories. Well, you have not done that. Yours is really a look at a network that extended across the world, and really we were very lucky to be here. Now, where is Gavin?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay.
Let me conclude, and I'm not going to speak for the 10 minutes that David seems to have allocated me. Let me conclude by thanking Rabbi John Levi for moderating this discussion, and thanking Sue for a fabulous address. Everyone should get out and purchase this book. It's terrific. Melbourne University Press. Fascinating for anyone interested in Australian Jewish history and Melbourne Jewish history in particular. You wonder where all the descendants of some of these Sephardi and Caribbean families have ended up in this day and age. It would be quite interesting. Some of the names are still floating around, even some still within the Jewish community, but one thinks they might have drifted away. But thank you, Sue, for a fabulous exposition on a fabulously interesting book, and thank you everyone for attending this terrific event. I think it's been very successful. I've been watching the numbers too. We've been sitting over 90 all night, and we're up to 98 at one stage. So you'd have to say it's been very, very successful. Thank you indeed. Now,
Can I say thank you to everyone for their interest and for coming?
Well, I think everyone's enjoyed it, and we're still learning. We're still learning, although a lot of us are on Zoom all the time. I think the Australian Jewish Historical Society is getting used to this. It's proved a very, very successful debut. If I can just reiterate that Dr. Avril Alba will, jointly with the Jewish Holocaust Centre, address our next meeting on the 22nd of October at 7:30. Dr. Alba is the Senior Lecturer in Holocaust Studies and Jewish Civilization at the University of Sydney. And further on from that, we will have Jessica North on a date to be announced in relation to Esther Abrahams. But
and she wrote a wonderful book.
yes, she wrote a wonderful book. So I think we can simply conclude and thank everyone for their attendance, and we'll get a bit more polished the way we conduct these, but it certainly proved very, very successful. And thank you very much, Sue. It's been a fabulous evening.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening.
Good. Thank you. Thanks everybody. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, David.